Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Meredith Bond with the City News digital team, and I'm joined by the team that has put together the Behind Closed Doors series, and Amber Wardell, who is the resource coordinator with the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Housing. City News and Omni News teamed up for the first time on this investigative series that explored the epidemic of family violence that is plaguing our country. We have all the written and broadcast stories on our website, citynews.ca and omnitv.ca, and you can also find the link in the description of this video. We are taking questions live throughout the entire thing, so if you do have a question, please write it in the comments. And I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves, starting off with our lead producer and director, Mahnoor Yawar.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mahnoor Yawar. I am a producer at City News, and I'm the lead coordinator for Behind Closed Doors. And Faiza is our lead reporter.
Thanks, Mahnoor. Yes, my name is Faiza Amin, and I was the lead reporter for City News. And I'm really happy to be here because I think these are going to be some of the most important conversations that we're going to be having as part of this series. And thank you so much to Amber for joining us here today. I think you're going to be answering a lot of much needed questions. So over to Eden for now.
Hi, my name is Eden, and I work with Omni Television as a digital content producer. I'm again very excited to be part of this series. It's something super important, and I think that's probably a great place to start off. Maybe a question just for everyone here. Why do you think this topic was so important to talk about?
I think, for me personally, these are stories that I've done over the years, and I noticed especially during COVID and having spoken with Owaith a number of times throughout the years, it just seemed like things were getting worse and worse. And I know that I'm not the only one who felt that this was a conversation that we not only needed to talk about, but these are important stories we need to shed light on, because this can be a very isolating period for people who are experiencing this violence at home, to know that for one, their stories are important. Two, that there is help out there. Three, we need to do more to be able to support them and the organizations out there who are helping them not only flee violence, but also at the same time addressing the systemic barriers that a lot of these victims and survivors are facing for decades now. And even prior to covering these stories during the pandemic, the problem was extremely visible. If you go speak to any women's shelters, they'll tell you they're operating beyond capacity. They don't like to turn anybody away. And I remember going particularly into one shelter in February of 2020, so just before the pandemic really got here in Canada, and she was telling me about how they had somebody coming in last night and they made a bed for her in the kitchen. And that's unacceptable. And when you take a step back and you think about, what if this was somebody that you cared about? What if this was your sister? What if this was your best friend? What if this was your colleague? Wouldn't you want them to be able to leave safely to a safer location and not be put through the violence that a lot of these women and individuals have been living for years? And so that's what kind of drives me, and I hope through this series, and we've been saying it over and over again, that people who are in similar positions know that there are a lot of people, like Amber, like Owaith, who are there for them, and they care and they matter. There's help out there. Or I also want people to know that, we should check in with our friends, because we never know. We called the series Behind Closed Doors, and we never know what some people are experiencing behind closed doors. And so that's why the project is extremely important for me.
And I want to add, so our other lead reporter from Omni, Levine Gill, this was to a large extent all people who had reached out to her for help. And it's so important to highlight here, as with Omni, I've worked for Omni before. I have a 4-year relationship with the station and its reporters, and with Levine herself. And this is something that's been so close to her heart, and so incredibly important to know that just because someone's English isn't perfect does not mean that there aren't services out there for them, does not mean that they are not in any shape or form less worthy of the help that they're looking for. And a lot of these stories, for not just the Punjabi community, but for racialized communities, for LGBTQS, for Indigenous women, this was an important thing for us to highlight, especially making sure that we provide them with conscious, culturally specific, and sensitive options, and tell them that, their story may not be unique, but their circumstances are not without any kind of support out there.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing we were talking about that Faiza mentioned was right now with the pandemic, it has just exacerbated the problem. I wonder if Amber might be able to speak on this a little bit, how much worse or how much less we know about what's going on behind closed doors because of the pandemic.
Yeah, so we know that isolation and gender-based violence have been very inextricably linked for a number of decades. Because it is something that largely goes on behind closed doors, whether or not it's within an intimate partnership or an ex-partner or a family member, all those different types of relationships. So there's a lot of changes to identifying the warning signs that have come with COVID because people aren't in community in the same way. They might have services they're connected with and they might not be able to access those services in person. So there's an adjustment there of, even if they are connected with professionals, of that ability to recognize and respond to warning signs. We have those who are living in rural or remote or northern communities who might have access to some of the, really technology has been embraced and there's new avenues there, but we know that that doesn't work for everyone. And we also have perhaps perpetrators, ex-partners, family members, someone who is perpetrating violence might be actually home with the person who's experiencing violence. We also have, if there's a lack of access to a translator, for example, it might be that their family member who might be abusive or partner, ex-partner is doing that translating. So that access to service has really, all of those barriers have been compounded during COVID. But we also know that all of those control pieces around controlling what someone, where they go, who they see, what they do, that piece of, saying stay home, we know that home isn't safe for everyone. So it really does create a lot of, exacerbation of things that were already happening, and really difficult situations for survivors in trying to seek safety.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the challenges that when reporting on this series and producing it that you ran into?
So a lot of the challenges here are obviously, they start on the very basic fact of it's not necessarily always as simple as, here's a woman who has gone through this abuse and has physical after effects showing. There is emotional coercion, there is financial abuse, there is elder abuse, which comes in many different ways or form. There's emotional abuse in many other ways that is invisible. There's children who are impacted many years, many decades after what it is. One of the main problems that our reporter Levine ran into when these women were talking to her was it was in the middle of COVID with stay-at-home orders everywhere, closures. It's not as easy as walking to a cafe and sitting down. So even in the dead of winter, how do we talk to these women and provide them the safety in order to be able to share their stories? And I mean, she did a fantastic job. Some of them walked right to the corner of the local strip mall to have a conversation with her. Some walked to her house in order to have the conversation. Just the many different ways that that safety could have been created for them. It's not as easy as what we can do, jump on a Zoom call and have this live right now. There's a lot of moving pieces in doing that. And of course, the other big challenge for us was a lot of them did not speak English, which was fortunate, because obviously Levine has a lot of access in the community, a lot of people willing to share their stories with her. However, how do we make that relevant towards a CityNews audience, that primarily speaks English? And I think we were fortunate to have two people with some command of the language in order to be able to translate some very delicate, sensitive topics and and not everything comes with a direct translation. Even if there are things that they are experiencing and saying that is very specific to a South Asian culture, for example, or very specific to a certain community, or a circumstance within our communities here. And I think that having the sensitivity to tell those stories is a project in and of itself, and having doing the work to do so and making sure that we are doing their stories justice was some of our biggest work there.
I think that's really important. I think this is also a great time to bring up that, this series is all about family violence, and we know the subject matter can be a very triggering topic for some of our audience. So we want you to know that it's okay to have those feelings. You need to prioritize your safety, your mental health, of course, but also that we do have resources for you on our website. And that's at the link that's been pinned already to this page. Going into our next question now, we have a question from Tom on Twitter who asks, how hard was it for you to tell these stories? And any recommendations when it comes to watching triggering content like this and how to deal with that?
Yeah, the stories were pretty difficult. A couple of them, I didn't understand the language, but you could just tell by the body language of the victims and survivors who were speaking. It was difficult to watch, and it was difficult to read these words. I just looked through it as a lens of a journalist, that these stories are extremely important to share. Our stories the majority of them were victim led. We chose their words, we chose what they were saying, we chose their experiences, and we kind of went through it this way. I don't know if I can comment on how to watch triggering content, but I can certainly understand that this is an important question. I don't know how to answer that part. I just to say that I just looked through it through a lens of a journalist, and I just felt that these stories were extremely important to tell, and so I just tried to look at it that way. I don't know if anybody else has anything to Amber, if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I think that when we watch something or absorb something or hear a story that's high impact, the reason why it's high impact is the connection with our senses. Mm-hmm. So you've got something that is kind of triggering a strong connection for you in sight, in smell, and in memory. You're picturing something. There's that kind of visceral piece. And so grounding is actually taking those senses and kind of turning it the other way. And you can make a kind of wellness kit that's things that bring you back when that triggering happens. So that would be, for example, a smell like peppermint that you find that has a positive association. I use nutmeg because I really like nutmeg in cooking. You might have a picture of something that's grounding, like your family. You might have something that you touch that's soft. I have like my daughter's hat in my little kit when she was a baby. So those pieces of, it's the senses that brought you there. And it's that visceral kind of grounding of feeling your feet on the floor and taking space away. It's okay to take space away. And sometimes to give yourself sleep before discussing what's bothering you. That helps your brain to kind of file away and compartmentalize what you found impactful.
Now that you mention it, actually, I'm just noticing now that I was burning candles more often, like probably for the first time in my life, more so that I have. So that's interesting. And I also stayed away from a lot of difficult content on TV. So I just watched a lot of kind of low level, doesn't take a lot of brain activity to consume. And I think I just saved my energy more for the project, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I just wanted to very quickly add that, obviously we're a very small team on this project. There were only 6 of us, and all of us lived this. We went through every second of testimony, every second of the research, every single element is going to live, I think, with us forever. Knowing the responsibility we have towards each other, these women, these victims, and survivors is a very, very difficult thing. And it's a massive responsibility on us. And I think all we told ourselves was, this isn't about us right now. It's about them. It's making sure they get the support, the services, the information they need in order to be able to protect themselves best. And I think in the coming days, as Faiza said, some of that coping is going to kick in for even the storytellers. But to us, it was more important than ever to say, it's not us right now, it's them.
And that's a privilege on itself too, right? The fact that we can check out, but other people can't, right? I see that differently now through this project, that I have the privilege to be able to check out of something difficult that a lot of people are living through. So.
I knew Levine has still been in touch with some of the victims. We spoke with our Omni reporter, but have we had any update on some of the people we spoke with throughout the series?
Yeah, so I have some updates for folks, and I'll just remind you here that in sharing their stories, as we've been telling you, that a lot of the victims that we spoke with are still under the same roof as their abuser. So, and we concealed their names. We didn't include anything too specific for that purpose. So Anita, you'll remember, she was a newcomer to this country. She has a son. He's 5 years old. And she was telling us about how her husband was abusive, and very graphic descriptions of the things that he would do to her. Her son eventually opened up, and it was something that she tried to protect and shield her son against. And her son, she didn't know this, but her son was actually witnessing a lot of what was happening in that household. He ended up going to the teacher and telling his teacher. That's when the teacher intervened. So Anita's update is that she has moved out with her son. And so I'm, I know we're all thinking about her, sending her a lot of love and support. And I hope everything works out with that. Maya, you recall, incredible young woman. She is an adult now. She lived in a household where her father, had a drinking problem and was extremely abusive towards her mother, but also used coercive tactics on Maya. And you recall that Maya was never afraid to call police to report, except, at that point she was 16 years old. And when she called CAS or CAS showed up because she called police, nothing was really done. And so she had a sense of hope for a second when she saw police at her home. But her father kept getting released and returning back home. So she still lives with her family, and her father is still in the house, but she tells us that their relationship isn't the same anymore. Jimmy, you'll remember Jimmy, he's he calls himself a former abuser who also had a drinking problem. So he says that he's been, I guess, clean for a couple of years. And now he's working with other people who have addictions. And I want to make it clear that, there are abusers who don't have addictions out there. And so these are two very separate issues there. And I know they can overlap, but I just want to be clear that there are just abusers out there too. Vina, she appeared in our story from yesterday. It's a story about how women are still faced with patriarchal pressures, where sons are the preference. In some extreme cases, women have been forced or undergo sex selective abortions, but that's extreme cases. Experts were telling us that in these households where there is a preference for sons, that there is abuse of all sorts. So Vina is trying to stay afloat still in the situation. She has 2 daughters, and she tells us that she's not going to try to have another baby just so she can have a son. So she's extremely proud of her 2 daughters, and yeah. So these are the updates that I have so far.
Thanks so much, Faiza. The next question we wanted to ask was, specifically, we teamed up with Omni to do this story, and we have all the versions of the story in Punjabi on the omnitv.ca website. Why was it important to look at family violence through a cultural lens as well?
I can take this question. I think it's super important when we're looking at family violence or any kind of issue in particular to look at the causes or the reasons behind that, for example, in our case, might have victims wanting to stay or feeling like they have no choice but to stay. And I think culture and like societal norms are a big part of that for a lot of people. And culture just adds another layer to that. So I think Levine, as Mahnoor said, going into the community and really talking to people on the front lines, you could say, of this issue was really an eye-opening experience, not only, for Omni television viewers who might not be in that same situation, but I think even for City viewers, as people on the outside of that culture or that community, not really understanding the things that these people go through, which is why, it's a question we bring up a lot, that question of why do they stay? I think something that not a lot of us understand. So I think having that cultural layer really helps us get a better idea. And I think something that a lot of our experts pointed out, on the Punjabi side, was that when these kinds of studies on communities are done, the community is very rarely part of those discussions. So we have people on the outside making these big decisions for people that don't even get a say in the process. So I think it was a really good thing for City and Omni to partner up and to share the stories from the community themselves with their own voices.
I really want to add sort of a very minor context to Levine and her relationship, her long relationship with these victims in the community. For the last 10 years, she has been raising her voice about specifically, the subject we learned about yesterday, which is sort of what a preference for sons has done psychologically and to a large extent in terms of abuse and intergenerational trauma in some communities. And once she started writing about that 10 years ago, women started writing to her and they started telling her about the different ways they were subjugated because of those patriarchal and those misogynistic biases at times, and just the work that she had done has grown into this place where we've come to talk about how unacceptable that abuse is, regardless of why it's happening, but to be able to tell that story with sensitivity requires a certain cultural context. And I think modern Western psychology, Western systems don't necessarily take into account the sort of colonial hangover that some of these communities are facing and the violence that they faced at the hands of these economic capitalist pressures, I think, specifically that caused, the economic need to have a son, for example, or why a woman being subjugated, it comes naturally with a lot of elements. So I think it was really important to know and say just our traditional systems and the barriers in place may be missing out on a certain few things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to direct this next question to Amber, and we do have a story coming this weekend on this exact topic, but it's a question that we've gotten a lot, which is how someone from the outside, how might you notice the signs that someone is abusive or being abused?
Yeah, so it's depending on the context of how you know that person. You can look for different warning signs and understanding that warning signs are really the tip of the iceberg. So you're looking for things that may be red flags. It doesn't mean necessarily that abuse or violence is occurring, but it's a great start to saying, could I have a conversation with the person who I have a relationship with that's in this family I'm concerned about? One of those signs are not, it's kind of different during COVID, but that her current baseline is changing as far as having people spending time with people, leaving the home, that kind of ability to go places, do things, and have a few extra minutes here and there. So that piece of I have to go, that very structured. There might be something in relation to changes with her, coping. So we might see that in relation to coping with the impacts of abuse or violence with drug or alcohol use, or kind of sign is. That person might seem tearful or anxious or angry, and really that goes for both someone who might be perpetrating violence as well. Some of those warning signs, trading control is often feeling very out of control. So the things we would associate with that in relation impulsive decisions, not keeping to schedules, so a lot of missing work. There's a number of workplace specific signs that you can look up through Make It Our Business if you're concerned about someone in a workplace context. And that piece of that you can tell that something has changed and they're really not sharing details about their lives in that same way. So often we look for bruises, but there's so many different types of violence that there might not be those physical signs. So for sure, a bruise that doesn't have a story that really makes sense, or where they don't want to share any details, that could be something that's a warning sign. But we do have to look beyond those. It might be that their finances seem to be quite different. That could be a sign of financial abuse. There could be forms of abuse in relation to parenting. And you might, if you're spending time with that person, even virtually, you might see her being put down. You might see, one person kind of all of the talking. You might see that one person, this is very common in very high-risk cases. The perpetrator seems really fantastic. So it seems they do everything, right? Their kids are, and people very close to the family might know that's not the case, but there's a facade of a really great person in the community wanting to maintain that facade, being a part of that power and control. So those pieces of, knowing, if you know the kids, that's where you'll see that there's a change. So those kind of unexplained changes and those small signs that add up, and a lot of nervousness in relation to details of what's happening. And fear would be a really a big factor as well. And if you know something's going on, so we think of people in relationships, but very high risk cases, high risk can come out of recently ended relationships, and that might be a year old even. So there's ending. Well, we know that there's changes in custody. We know that there's issues with access, so there's been a lot of changes to court and supervised. What's happening in that situation, because it could be something where someone you feel like, oh, they're okay, they're safe, right? I don't need to make sure they're connected with a service or whatever that is, their local shelter, for example, because they've left the relationship, but they're actually more at risk. Because that person might not be okay that they've left the relationship, or with the outcomes in relation to the kids or the house or any of those.
I think I have a little follow-up to that. We're obviously so focused on the victims and supporting the victims and seeing the signs of abuse in the victims. But, one of the things that we did focus on is the abusers themselves and seeing the signs of abuse in them and kind of preventing it at the source before it gets to the victim. So do you have any advice on how we can kind of look for signs in them?
Yeah, so I think, when you look at signs for a man who might be perpetrating abuse, that might be something where, as I say, he does all the talking. He might suggest that he's the victim. So that's that kind of facade piece. Depression. So kind of things related to mental health would definitely be a connection there. Sometimes there is, that piece of him owns her that we might see. And in general, I think that one of the dynamics that we would see is just that imbalance of power. Right. So when you talked about addiction, for example, that's something that's sometimes called a contributing factor, but it's not the root. Yeah. The root is power and control, right? And that also reflects the status of women. And there's a piece that's beyond what's going on in that house. And all of her ability to have choice is beyond that house. But really, if we look at what choices. And is she someone who, does it seem like in that relationship that one person has more power than the other person has, right? So that would be an indicator. And I think one of the greatest, things to think about just in relation to how to help is whoever it is you have the relationship with, be the bridge. So if you have a relationship with a man who is a colleague, for example, and you feel like he might, he's been saying things about recent court outcomes and you have a bit of a sense of that relationship and you're concerned, there are definitely specific resources to guide you in having a conversation with him. You wouldn't have that conversation while she's there. You would have that conversation, with some kind of safety parameters around it. It wouldn't be confronting both of them and it wouldn't be in a confrontational way. So that piece of can I offer something and connecting with service, needs. Sometimes it's something where there's an immediate threat and it would be a reporting situation. But in a lot of these situations where we're seeing the warning signs, if we could catch them early, we would actually be preventing tragedies from occurring and things and actions to a point where those impacts are long lasting and can never be reversed. So that piece of intervention, how to be the bridge, we have to be really creative. Sometimes that means we can see that like there's shelters available, there's service available, there's supports available for him as well. How do they access those supports? How does she access them safely? So we can be that bridge by, even saying, if you want to meet me at the grocery store, give me a grocery list. I'll do your grocery shopping. I'll give you my phone, right? I'll sanitize it afterwards. I'll give you my phone. You can call for help. You can call the Assaulted Women's Helpline and connect with someone and be planning and what those resources are. And no one will know because it was on my phone and you had your groceries when you came back and you came back in the hour that you had to get those groceries, right? So it's tricky. So whether you're reaching out to him or you're reaching out to her, or you're concerned about the kids, for sure, check out our website, oath.ca. We've got lots of links to resources. Call your local violence against women service, and you can look them up, sheltersafe.ca, and you can call them and say, here's the specific situation. What do I do, right? Whether that's trying to help in a way that's focused on kind of intervention for her or him or who you're really connected with.
Hey, Amber, that's a great point too, because we always talk about interventions for her, right? Check in on your friends, help them get out or get access to services. But, and just speaking about kind of putting the onus back on the abuser, how can friends of the abuser hold that person accountable or intervene? You said, play the role of a bridge. How can they intervene in that sense? Because we know that from hearing from our victims, a lot of them heard from family friends and families themselves. Women were told, why would you leave a marriage? What was it that you said to make him angry? Don't do that again. So how could they have played a better role in being a bridge instead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are some great tools out there for how to have that conversation, sort of on my alerts here, and how to really be that bridge effectively. And you really want to cater that conversation to the connection that you have. Mm-hmm. And you're never going into one of those conversations saying, I'm going to solve and fix everything that's happening. What you're likely trying to do is foster, safety and accountability through connection with professionals. So White Ribbon, definitely, if we're looking at creating more awareness and men and boys supporting gender-based violence and women's rights, or supporting the end to gender-based violence and women's rights, White Ribbon has some great resources for that and education. That piece around, I think someone is acting unsafely with a partner or a family member, what do I do? You're going to be the bridge to someone who can foster that accountability with a great skill set. They will not learn off a website. However, you can learn from a website, you can learn from a pamphlet, you can learn from your local service how to effectively make that connection. So it's saying, I'm worried about you. This is why I'm worried about you. This is good for him or her, whoever you're worried about. Tell them why you're worried and what you've seen. You're not talking about rumors, but what you've actually seen and noticed, and you're linking it with that specific kind of red flag or warning sign. And then you're letting them know, here's somewhere that can help. So that might be you connecting them with their local, the local service provider that does abuse services for men, for example. It might be that before you have that conversation, you connect with your local shelter to see where you should be connecting them to. And they might give you a pamphlet or a resource. Or you might have a conversation about, is it safe? How will that go? Right? So I think we have to walk through these things a little bit with the professionals before we try to be that bridge in situations that might be dynamic and high risk. And we really don't know when we're seeing that top of the iceberg, right? But people have a hesitation, they're going to make it worse. It is very, very unusual that people, by saying I'm worried and I'm here to help and the door's open and here's a resource, that they're going to make that worse. They're going to maybe, provide a connection that could really change a survivor's life.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to also say we do have a bunch of resources on the citynews.ca page on the behind closed doors, the link in the description of this. We have, and they're specific to if you are someone who thinks someone else is experiencing abuse or male abusers. We also have a few, we haven't touched on this a little bit, but we do have resources for online safety for someone who might be living in an abusive household and is trying to look for those resources, but is afraid that someone might check their internet history or come up behind them when they're online. So we do have a few things in place for people to learn about that as well. And I think we have time for one last question. This is from another Twitter user, and it was, was there anything that surprised you doing this series or that you didn't think was still happening in the 21st century? Especially with a conversational focus on equity and equality and feminism.
I think for me, the sun preference story blew me out. That story in itself blew me out, and the pressures on women itself and the extreme cases that occur. Something else though that kind of, and this is why it's so important to speak with victims and survivors and experts. The court process of I was speaking with Pamela Cross, and she's with Luke's Place, and she was telling me how once a victim leaves a relationship or goes through the court process, it doesn't mean that the violence stops right there. A lot of them continue to face violence afterwards, and they look at the system, and there are barriers there that might deter someone from continuing, time, resources, money. And she was telling me over 60% of women end up representing themselves in court. That is astronomical. And that I think is unacceptable, because I wouldn't know the first place to start when going through the court process. And she was talking to me about the different ways. And, I wasn't thinking about this, admittedly, I wasn't thinking about this myself, that these women are continuing to face violence. For example, something so small as, or it's not small, but sharing custody and the child has a soccer practice is the example that she used. Well, there needs to be some sort of coordination on that end if the woman doesn't have custody herself. And so she's forced to remain in contact with the person who's abusing her, who she's trying to leave. And another thing that blew me out the water was the use of technology, nanny cams being in the household, a way of, the man to continue controlling the woman, control over heats, control over sensors, small things that we have in the household. If she's staying there, he's still able to control the temperatures or control the nanny cams. And Pamela Cross was telling me stories about clients being in the household and their abusers spewing things to them, threats through the nanny cams. And you know, and she said, women, it's at that point that a lot of people are deterred from going through this system because they think to themselves, well, I know what to expect if I'm in a relationship with him. I don't know what he's going to do if I'm accessing the court process and I'm meeting all these barriers, and he's still harassing me using coercive tactics during this process. I don't know how much worse it could get, and that's what deters a lot of women. And I thought, you know, what a scary process to go through, even when you make that huge decision of leaving, and having to navigate something even scarier in that process.
I think to add to that, Faiza, all of those things were genuinely eye-opening, and you know, I don't know if I'm necessarily surprised by anything. I think disappointed for sure. I think there's a genuine sense of obviously responsibility for all of us, accountability for all of us to keep this up. We wouldn't be doing these stories if they weren't still in a place where there's work to be done. You know, it's interesting, Faiza, you mentioned the surprise about a son preference still in this day and age. And I was reflecting the first time we had a conversation about it, that when you were surprised about it, I had almost accepted that was a normal thing. In some communities, that's so normalized. I think to me, this series was an eye-opening moment to say, you know what, taking away the choice of a woman to have a child or not have a child, taking away, you know, the neglect and the taunts and all of those things are all abuse. I think that terminology, I think that acceptance of what it is called and how to tackle it and why it's wrong was definitely a journey for me. And I hope for a lot of our audience members too, who all think that, you know, these are things that aren't necessarily recognized, or seen as valid or seen as bad enough to want to leave or get help for. I think a lot of those definitions, those normalizations, those acceptances are so deeply embedded that I really hope that this series was a way to rethink it.
Can I also add that something more personal that took me back to was about 6 women reached out, women that I know I consider friends, reached out to me and said that they were in abusive relationships. That was shocking to me.
Wow.
That was shocking to me. And that's the whole thing, right? You don't know. So more on a personal level.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did want to ask this one last question because we have talked a bit about it amongst ourselves, but what was your hope at the end of this series for both Faiza and Mahnoor?
I think for me, just it being able to share the stories, and telling those victims and survivors their stories matter, and showing that this is happening. And, you know, also I think, and I'm so grateful to CityNews and my managers for allowing us to work on this project and giving us the time to do so. I want to let people know that we care. We care. Your stories are important. What you're going through is unacceptable. The barriers that you've been met with, those are unacceptable. And if this helps one person in any way possible, I think I would, I mean, I hope it'll help someone. And to also shed light on what frontline support staff are working with, the realities that they're faced with, the challenges that they're faced with. If they've been operating at capacity and overwhelmed with the volume of people who need help prior to the pandemic, then what's happening now?
I think, and to add to that, I mean, I don't feel like the series is ending because I just feel like we've just scratched the surface of a lot of these conversations. Yeah. I think this is an ongoing issue. I really hope people realize that you cannot just look away and think it's behind closed doors for someone else. These are your problems. These are your friends, your family members. They are your people. And you need, I feel like if anything has come out of this pandemic, it's this realization that everyone's in a certain amount of pain together, and we need to care and take care. And so I hope this begins a conversation of redefining who needs to take the onus to take on a system, and where our system has the gaps to help people come out of it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and being able to have this conversation. I think it's very important. Thank you, Amber, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you,
and
Amber.
yeah, giving us
Thank you,
access to
Amber.
those resources.
I also want to shout out before I go, though, the work of Meredith and Eden and the sensitivity with which all of our web presence is out there. I deeply encourage everyone watching to go and read every single article. They have worked day and night living with these stories to put out. So thank you guys all for joining the cause.
Thank you.
Amber, any final words, Amber, that you want to add that we didn't ask you about? I always ask anybody who I interview if there's anything else they want to add.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, the scope of what we often think of as shelters is actually pretty broad in most communities. And so even if someone isn't talking about leaving, even if someone's not sure what support they need, they don't need to leave and physically go to a shelter. Often in many situations, in order to increase their safety, they can connect over the phone anonymously 24 hours a day. They can find their local shelter service, women's service at sheltersafe.ca. And those services can do such good work. The community just needs to be aware of them and connect the people who need them with those resources. And we really can change these conversations. But thank you all for inviting us and for having this conversation, for prioritizing it, and for all of the work that you do.
Thanks, Amber. Await does amazing work out there, and you guys have been some of the biggest advocates. So thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I just want to remind everyone that you can read all the broadcast and written stories on our website, citynews.ca, and we will have more stories coming out this weekend as well. There's about 4 or 5 more stories, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.